I have a feeling that I'm going to ultimately just be tying together a lot of themes that have been percolating over the course of the last day. But I wanted to just start with a line. There's a line of poetry that I think about almost every day. And it comes from Mary Oliver, who passed away last month, who was, of course, one of the few poets people who just stumble into Barnes & Noble or click on Amazon happen to buy. And her great theme, of course, was how we needed to pay greater attention to the world, which she did through taking long walks on Cape Cod and staring at leaves and looking at foxes. And she wrote a line that, as I said, just sticks with me, which is that attention is the beginning of devotion. Attention is the beginning of devotion. That when I think about Facebook and I think about when I think about the Google world that we've stumbled into, we have such a hard time truly registering the damage that they have done to us. And I think that the greatest violence that they've done to us as individuals is that they make it hard for us to be devoted. Attention is the beginning of devotion. In order to be a spiritual person, in order to be a truly loving person, you need to be able to pause and pay attention. And I'll get to the political and economic problems of the platform monopolies, but I think that we always need to return to the core question of attention. That the reason that they amass so much data is that they are composing this cartography of our mind, that they've figured out how to map our psyche. That data is such a bloodless word, but data is a dossier that helps to unlock us. So data is more than just the things that you willingly submit to these companies, of course. It is everything that you've read on the internet. It is every question that you begin to enter into Google. When you begin to compose a post on Facebook and delete it, that too is saved by their pack rat servers, that the cost of computing is so cheap, they're able to amass everything, whether it's important to them in the short term or not. They don't know what's important, so they keep everything. And the algorithms troll in order to find the hidden patterns in the way that you think. And the result is that they've been able to probe you in order to find the things that cause you pleasure, to find the things that cause you anxiety. And that data, that portrait of the inside of your head, is in turn used in order to manipulate you, in order to commandeer as much of your attention as possible. And so this is the world that we live in, and it's a world in which, and that is the basis for the power of Facebook and Google. And part of the power is its invisibility. That if the polling that's been done of Facebook users shows pretty clearly that even in spite of the Facebook scandals, in spite of everything that has been exposed in the New York Times or on TV about Facebook, people are still largely unaware of the existence of the algorithm and the fact that the news and information that they're consuming has been given a sense of hierarchy. It's not just friends showing friends articles or pictures. That there's a sense of hierarchy that's been imposed on the news and information that we consume via the platforms, and that information has been arrayed in such a way to keep us engaged for as long as possible, to occupy as much of our attention as possible. Now, I consider this to be a public health problem because I know this for myself. I mean, even though I wrote a book trashing these companies, and even though I'm fully aware of all the perils that they pose, I wouldn't be honest with you if I didn't admit that I'm engaged in a deep struggle with my own relationship to technology. That if I wanted to get a good night's sleep, I have to stick my phone in the basement, because otherwise I know that there'll be a moment in the middle of the night where I reach for my phone and I get trapped in a zombie scroll. And you wake up the next morning and you know that your rhythms have been completely knocked off and you have zero recollection of the thing it is that you looked at in the middle of the night. And so when I talk to people at the companies, I use the word addiction, which they'll respond, whoa, don't go there. That's a scientific term. What we produce, yes, it's designed to get people engaged for as long as possible, but I really do think that we need to think of it as a form of addiction. And so if I were to distill the peril that is posed by these companies, it's something that begins at the level of the individual, and then we can see how it's replicated at other levels, which is this relationship that is totally unhealthy, where we're either, you could call it addicted or dependent. And the dependency that we each feel on our phones is something that's replicated in larger parts of the economy. That these companies are now engaged in an arms race to become our personal assistant. And that's the reason why they're all trying to implant those little speakers in the corner of your bedroom or your kitchen or wherever, and so that you'll be engaged in a never-ending conversation with their machine. And you'll ask the machine questions, and the machine will supply answers. And the dream of Silicon Valley is frictionlessness, that you need to be, you should be relieved of the burden of making unnecessary decisions or unnecessary choices. Information and things should be delivered to you in the most seamless, effortless sort of way so that you can focus on whatever else. And as a result, that gives them even more power, because at least when you're looking at a Google search, everybody clicks on the thing that appears first or second. Nobody makes it to page 2, but at least there's a menu of options. But as we become more merged with these machines and as we interact with them in ways that are different from conventional reading, the less choices we're ultimately going to have. And it'll just see whatever Google, what's the news today? Whatever Google spits out, it's not going to be look at option A, B, and C. It's going to be whatever option A that they've provided to you is. And the dream ultimately is this human dream. Technology is one of the things that defines us as a species, our ability to affect our environment. We've always been merging with machines. The hammer is an extension of the arm. The factory is the automation of upper body strength. But these are intellectual machines. And when we merge with these machines, of course, we're not just merging with a tool. We're merging with the companies that operate them. And so they've amassed incredible power over our public square, as we've been talking about, over our economy, and also, I think, over the future of our species. And one of the things that's so startling, when I was researching my book, I spent a lot of time on YouTube. And watching the founders of these companies speak. And as you listen to them, you realize the ways in which the technology press doesn't always serve us well, because when Larry Page or Mark Zuckerberg speaks, they don't just speak about the latest app or the latest camera resolution that they're unveiling. They often say quite important and profound things about human nature, about about the ways that we organize ourselves. And I think that they have a very strong view of human nature. And if you look at it on the surface, we've spent a lot of time assuming that the titans of Silicon Valley were libertarians, because of course they don't want to be regulated. And a lot of them read Ayn Rand at some point, and maybe that was the last book that they ever read. And so they spent a lot of time talking about it. But if you listen really hard to what they're saying, it's something that's quite different than a Randian view of individualism. That ultimately, the way that they think about the world is a collectivist one in its outlook. That's why media is social, why it's a hive mind, why everything should be crowdsourced. And there's this kind of fetishization, ultimately, of the collective. And I think it helps explain part of the reason why these companies have been so insensitive to individualism and individuality, why they're so willing to roll privacy, why they have such a dismissive attitude towards authorship. Part of the reason why they're so happy to have their algorithms displace free will in any way, shape, or form. And it's part of the reason why they ultimately view monopoly as the platonic state of capitalism. The world is a network, and the network needs to be captured. And if the network is captured by one firm, well, that's just the natural way of the world, and it's the system that will deliver, in the end, the most efficiency. And we see this in journalism, where Facebook and Google have come. At first, they were perceived as friends. They were a means of breaking down an old elitist world where you had these fuddy-duddy gatekeepers sitting at the New York Times and the Washington Post who didn't pay sufficient heed to the people out there. And it seemed like it was a means of both liberation, and then it was also a means to reach this much, much larger audience, because if you publish something and it got linked to in Google or Facebook, it was suddenly accessible to a much, much wider world. And it was greeted at first, as I said, as a friend. But we've seen now that just like I am unhealthily dependent on my cell phone, media and the world achieved a similar sense of unhealthy dependence on the platforms. So I'll just give you a small anecdote. As Eric said, I was the editor of The New Republic, which was this little magazine that always had a small audience. I think that there was a point where in History of the 1960s, I read the author said that the total circulation of the New Republic could have never filled half of the University of Mississippi football stadium. It was a small magazine that was self-consciously elitist and never had a terribly large audience. But then we had a particularly bracing contact with Facebook, because the magazine was bought by Mark Zuckerberg's roommate from college, who happened to be Facebook employee number 3. And we started off, when he bought the magazine, having really noble intentions about having a benefactor, an enlightened benefactor, who wanted to help the magazine navigate its way into the new digital era with dignity. And it all started off great, but then there became this inevitable moment where he said, you know what, the stations of magazine ownership. The first station is you come in and you express your noble intentions, and then the second station is you begin to panic about all the money that you spent at the first station, and then the third station is you start to overreact. And so he said, you know what, I know exactly how we can make money quickly, which is by producing things that get traffic on social media. And so we installed a Facebook guru on our staff. And in a very compressed period of time, we experienced something that the rest of media experience, which is that you begin to think about producing, how can I master the platform? How can I produce the things that will go viral on the platform? Because the platform suddenly offers me this opportunity to reach this much broader world that I would have never been able to get through print. But then you start to realize that you're not mastering the platform. The platform is actually mastering you, because the values of the platform end up implanting themselves in your brain. You begin to think, you begin to play by the rules that the platform has set. And I'll give you, there's a small example of this. There was a lion a couple years ago who was like the Kim Kardashian of lions, called Cecil, an endangered species, who was killed by a hunter who was a dentist from Minnesota, who posted a picture of Cecil on Facebook. Everybody, quite rightly, is roused into a fit of anger over the murder of Cecil. And the key word in our era is trending. Everybody wants to tap into the thing that is at the trailhead of its ascent to popularity. And we all see this in our offices, in our media offices, because we have access to all this data now ourselves. Every journalist has something called Chartbeat, which is this meter that shows how popular something is at any given moment. If you walk into the newsroom of the Washington Post, there are these massive television screens hovering over the newsroom, showing what's popular at any given moment. And that's a statement of values. That management is telling its journalist, you want to be up there at the top of that screen. And so Cecil gets killed. You start to see these pockets of outrage on the internet, and you say, I want some of that traffic too. And so every news organization begins to converge on the same subject. And in the end, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, I'm sure Us Weekly, BuzzFeed, whatever, everybody converges on Cecil the lion. And in the end, there are 3.2 million stories that are written about the sad death of Cecil the lion. And I think it shows a couple things. In part, one of the promises of the platforms, of Facebook, of Google, was that we would arrive into this golden age of personalization, that it was a place where we would all find our niche, and our niche would be served. But really, the rise of the platforms have allowed us some of that, but they've also contributed to a new age of conformism. It's very hard to see sometimes, but it's happened. And it's also see the way that that media begins to think so much more about audience, and that it creates these feedback loops. One of the most, I think, important terms of our age is the filter bubble concept, that we exist in a world where our biases are constantly being confirmed. And that too is its own form of conformism, that once you get sorted into your filter bubble, into your community, you're being served the information that you want to hear. And we've seen the ways in which that's incredibly dangerous, because when your bias is constantly being confirmed, you're in the process of being intellectually weakened. You become susceptible to fake news, propaganda, demagoguery. I would argue that in a way our current president is the political version of Cecil the lion. That when Trump came onto the scene, I think that a lot of media, liberal media, had its own reasons for paying attention to Donald Trump. That when he talked about Barack Obama's birth certificate, that anger that generated was something that liberal media like to tap into as well. because they saw the ways in which it would give us traffic. Eric, how much time am I doing all right?
Yeah, you got 5 to 10 minutes.
All right. And so the question is, I think ultimately, so BuzzFeed, I think we've seen what's happened to BuzzFeed, which is the classic example of a media organization that set out to master the platform, but then became mastered by it. Jonah Peretti, who founded BuzzFeed, was a graduate student at the MIT Media Lab. And his PhD dissertation was about the concept of virality. And he conducted an experiment when he was a graduate student that tried to make the concept of Nike sweatshop labor into something that would travel virally. And he started to try to figure out the ways in which content could be produced to explode over Facebook. And he built a massive media organization that was suddenly talked about in the same breath as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian. And it was all premised on its relationship to Facebook, that it was producing. Didn't matter if you went to BuzzFeed.com to get the news, or if you accessed it on Pinterest or Instagram or Facebook. It was all about creating pieces of content that tapped into people's emotions and therefore traveled across these social networks. And it became phenomenally successful, and it attracted investment from all the big players in the industry. But in the end, that dependence on Facebook made BuzzFeed enormously vulnerable, because all it took was Facebook changing its business strategy, changing its algorithms, and they were hosed. And that's what happened at the beginning of last year. Facebook decided that it was because of the Cambridge Analytica scandals and because of the Russia scandals, Facebook said that the news business was leaving it too vulnerable, and that it was recommitting to its core mission, which was connecting individuals. And so a BuzzFeed article was suddenly less privileged by the Facebook algorithm, and the picture you were sharing of your cat got boosted. And then it had the perverse effect of destroying the news organizations that were most catered to Facebook. And as a result, Facebook had to lay off last week, I think it was 15% of its staff. It had to shut down whole bureaus that it had opened up. And so what's the response to this dependent situation that we've created? Of course, there are personal responses. I think that there's kind of the Mary Oliver response, which is to disconnect yourself from the machine in order to create circumstances where you're able to reclaim ownership of your attention. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the policy responses. But we have traditions in this country within our political economy that should equip us to respond to these monopolies. That if you look at the history of the United States, we've always been very, very concerned about concentrations of power in the communications space. That the post office was the first communications monopoly, but we didn't let it extend into the telegraph business. And then when Western Union achieved a monopoly in the telegram business, we didn't let it, Ulysses S. Grant threatened to nationalize it, and they were so worried about the government taking strong and decisive action against it that they were afraid to get into the telephone business. And then when AT&T was in the telephone business, they created this essentially deal with the government where they kept their monopoly in a regulated sort of way, but they were also afraid of getting into the radio business. And then NBC got divided into NBC and ABC when NBC was too powerful as a radio station. And then the Nixon administration opened up space to create the cable news industry. And the last major example of this, of course, is I think one of the most underrated moments in recent American political economy, which was the Microsoft case, where the government said to Microsoft, we don't like the abusive way that you've used your power with the browser and the desktop, and we're going to stop you. And in the shadow of 9/11, the Bush administration stayed its hand and didn't go as far as perhaps it could have into ultimately breaking up Microsoft. But what happened is you had countervailing powers in effect that Microsoft for a decade was scared. And if you talk to people at Google, they'll say that Microsoft could have strangled us in our crib, but they didn't. So antitrust and this great tradition of anti-monopoly thinking and legislation and that impulse has actually been an incredibly important engine of innovation, of creating space for challengers to walk in and take on the incumbents who seem so entrenched. And when you listen to people today, you just get the sense, so this backlash has emerged against Facebook and Google, and it's come really, really suddenly. And I think it's taken the companies by surprise, and Facebook especially has done a pretty terrible job of managing its public image. It was underinvested, they probably would admit that they would have been underinvested in lobbying and the resources that would allow them to engage. But that's because the backlash came so suddenly. But even still, even with the ferocity of the backlash that's come on the heels of the Russia scandals and the Cambridge Analytica scandals, it's still so hard for us to imagine, I think, government taking meaningful action against these companies. I mean, there's the example in Europe now that we can look towards, but even that feels, I think, fairly distant from where we're sitting right now. And so, Eric was, I think, making fun of me for being incredibly bleak before we got up here. And I am fairly bleak when it comes to the possibility of government taking action in the next couple of years. But the thing that does give me the greatest deal of encouragement, and I'll end it here, I think is that alongside the political track and alongside the fact that you will have Democratic presidential candidates talking about economic concentration probably for the first time in several generations in this campaign. Elizabeth Warren, I think, has been especially vocal on the question. It's something that she's spent a whole lot of time thinking about. I do think that there's the possibility of an individual backlash happening as well. Facebook's profits are still ginormous and not slowing down, but I do think that we're at a moment where we're starting to pause as individuals to think again about this. The example that I use in the book that I find most inspiring is our relationship to the book. That when Amazon debuted the Kindle at $9.99 per book, it seemed like this irresistible thing. Here was every volume in human history suddenly accessible for less, and you could download it in a heartbeat. And Nicholas Negroponte, who is the head of the MIT Media Lab, said, by the year 2015, paper books will disappear. And lo and behold, we made this collective decision, I think it was largely subconscious, to resist the thing that was most convenient, to resist the thing that was cheaper, because we made a decision that we wanted to inhabit spaces where we're not constantly being notified, where our attention is not always being hijacked, where you're not umbilically connected to a corporate store, where there was this place where your attention really could be the beginning point of devotion. Thank you.
Right. So while we get this technological marvel going, I just have one comment that Frank reminded me of when he was talking about his experiences at the New Republic. I used to write for one of the country's major news weeklies on a regular basis about pretty much the kinds of subjects we've been talking about for the last 24 hours. And at one point they told me that my metrics would go up and I would get better placement if I could find a way to mention Britney Spears more often. I'm not making that up. All right, we have a technological marvel here.